My name is Mary Lou Rutherford. I was asked to do a presentation for our local Devil's Gate History Club of my life in Georgetown for 62 years. This was in March of 2016, and I've had so many requests to repeat it that we thought we would do a video of it together for those that might like to know what happened in my 62 years. Actually, I was here more than 62, was more like 70, because we came here as a family from Chicago, where I grew up, on our vacation and spent 2 weeks in sometimes Silver Plume and sometimes Georgetown. My father loved the West, and he came here before he was even married, and then he and my mother honeymooned out here. So he was a staunch supporter of the West, and when the three of us girls came along, why, there was nothing to do but jump in the old 38 Plymouth and head for Colorado. We started staying in Silver Plume and rented a cabin there, or a house, from Ma Buckley, who was an established family up there in 1945 and 46. And we jokingly say that was the low rent district. And then we moved to Georgetown, to the high rent district in 47, 48, and 49. And we rented a room in what is now the Hamel House. It was then called the Alpine Lodge. And we all stayed in one room, I think in 3 beds, 2 parents and 3 kids. It didn't take me long to find the Rutherford Stables, which was on the corner of 10th and Taos, where the Presbyterian Manse house is. I spent most of my free time there, picking up horse poop or generally becoming a nuisance. But I could ride a horse for $1 an hour or $5 a day. That is quite a bargain considering today's rates. I spent my free time cleaning tack sometimes. There were a dozen or so horses tied to the hitch rail, 4 Rutherford boys, Bill, Buff, John, Glenn, and one sister, Jean, the parents, Bill and Ethel Rutherford, and Ethel's mother, Emma Eklund, all living in a 3-room, 1-bathroom house, coal and wood stove for cooking and heating, no refrigerator. Oh, and that sparks an interest. Do you know you can make Jell-O in a copper bathtub? They'd fill the bathtub with cold water and set the mixed Jell-O in it, and lo and behold, you'd have Jell-O in an hour or so. Each summer I would get a little more brazen and size up the 4 brothers. By 1947, I was pretty sure, and I set my cap for Buff. He was 18 and I was 15. The 2 older boys, Bill and Buff, joined the Army, so I spent the next several summers helping their father, Bill, run the stable. My job was to saddle a horse, herd the rest of them down to the meadows and graze from 5 till 8 a.m. The horses were stabled overnight in a corral 3 blocks north of the family home on property owned by the Rutherford family. It's where I have lived since 1959. US 6 ran along the side of Main Clear Creek, through town and up to Silver Plume, including 2 tight switchbacks. The road was closed in Bakerville in the wintertime. Traffic was non-existent. I maybe saw a dozen cars in 3 hours. Of course, we'd all wave to each other. It was a big deal. Here was a cowgirl on her horse that people had never seen before. Whoopee! This grazing time was repeated again in the evening. This may have been the only feed, as I don't recall seeing baled hay, just a feeding of oats occasionally. It seemed like there was a large bunch of teenagers with which I quickly became acquainted. Some parents and aunts and uncles still live in town here. Mary Lou Schaller, Kay Wiseman, Jimmy Bruff, Kurt Marvel, all kids about my age. Population was about 300 at the time. Let's go down memory lane. and look at 6th Street, which was then called Alpine Street, as I remember it in the 40s. To get you oriented, I have to give you a little direction lesson. This valley for about 6 miles runs north and south, which is very confusing to the average person. So when you're looking down the valley, you're looking north. Up the valley is south. And off to my left as I speak is east, and of course to my right is west. We're going to start with the present post office. In 1945, it was a horse corral owned by a local attorney, Hank Luty. It was a whole block long and crossed even into the creek. Now we're coming east across Argentine streets. The lots were empty, just old foundations of previous buildings, and I can still visualize the youngsters playing cops and robbers jumping in and out of the old foundations. The Georgetown Trading Post was where the Shop International is now. They sold groceries on the left and dry goods on the right. Upstairs, the Masonic Hall was built, and it's still active as it was then. The old Red Ram, or Lucha's Cantina, was called the Loop Bar and Grill. That was the very popular watering hole. Post office was on the corner where Ophelia's is now located. Upstairs was a Mountain Bell telephone office. Now crossing Rose Street, we're still going east. On the corner was the Grubstick Restaurant, run by Ben Draper, a professor from DU, had a house here in town, and he was quite the promoter. He used to call his celebrations the Big Do. The photograph on the corner that says Worst Wines, etc., was done by a local painter, and he wasn't paid on time, so it was supposed to say the best wines on it, but he changed it to worst in the middle of the night, and it stayed that way for a long, long time. The picture on the right of that is the Cushman building. As it stood in 45, of course, it was 3 stories high, but in 1969 we had a 18-inch snowstorm in May, and the 3rd floor collapsed onto the street. Nobody was killed, but several were hurt, and obviously several cars were damaged. Now we're going on down the street to the corner of this Cushman building. It was a machine shop during World War II, and the fabricating structures were still mounted on the floor. Across Tow Streets, where the Happy Cooker is now, lived the town's police judge, George Straub. Next to him, the Star Hook and Ladder, the old firehouse, which still contained the old fire equipment, the hose carts and the ladder carts. On down the street is the hydroelectric plant built in 1902, was and still is humming along with the original Pelton water wheel. The Hotel de Paris, once a thriving place to stay and dine, was pretty quiet then. Hazel McAdams, the proprietress, still received guests occasionally. I will expand more on the hotel later in my talk. Next to the hotel was the site of the McClellan Opera House, which sadly burned down in 1892. The story is that the owner, Erskine McClellan, was thawing out his water pipes in the cellar and literally set his own building on fire. Such a sad tale. Across Tow Street, we're going west now, were several vacant lots, then the Georgetown Drug and Liquor Store. The drugstore was the local teenager hangout. The owner, Leola, was very patient with our behavior. She had a small liquor store in the very front. It was more like a closet under lock and key. So the traffic in the drugstore also included the Gallo wine set. Next we have a picture of the McClellan Hall. This was a movie house in those days, and the box that you see up in the middle there was for the projector because they needed distance to project the film on the stage. Beautiful building. Eventually, this beautiful theater was divided into 3 shops, as they are now. Next to the theater was the Nigel and Anderson, or is, grocery and hardware, a landmark then and now. 1883, many generations of Andersons still operating it. On West, there were empty lots next to the hardware store. Now, if we could back up a little bit to the north side of 6th Street off of Rose, the Buckley Garage, still standing there but inoperable now, would check your oil and wash all of your windows, not just your windshield, for free. Up the street, the Tea Room, which is there now, was then the St. James Restaurant, another Ben Draper endeavor. Across from the restaurant in the post office building, the Fish Block, was a small leather shop called Colorado Craft, run by my father-in-law, Bill Rutherford. He made saddles and belts and wallets, repaired shoes, and was quite a hangout place for me and the Rutherford family. Around the corner from the library, where Troy's is now, used to be the red and white grocery store, but it closed in the 30s. In 1959, my father opened a coffee shop there called Curly's Coffee House. It was strictly coffee and donuts, that was all for the first year. And then eventually he opened a weather station, and he would report on local weather and ski reports from the various ski areas, which were just really starting to get going. It was about the only social daytime gathering place for the town. I ended up working there part-time for him. Now we go south on Rose Street. It was a Texaco gas station where Aunt Abby's Brass Antique store was. Across from 5th Street was the Barnes Billiard Hall. It used to be the Victorian Lady. Now east, up to 5th Street to Argentine, you'd find the Clear Creek County Courthouse. 5th Street extended clear to the creek where the old stone jail stood. The log cabin that is now behind the post office was across 5th Street from the courthouse and housed the attorney Hank Luty in his office. This completes the circle. So now on to what I did to make my life in Georgetown so very special. My husband Buff and I returned to Georgetown in 1954 from the ranch where we worked for 3 years north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado. In the spring of 1954, the Colonial Dames had just purchased the Hotel de Paris from Hazel McAdams and were seeking a caretaker for the hotel. Buff and I were hired, and I soon became the first curator. Buff went off to work at A Basin via US 6 over Loveland Pass. He worked there for 5 years. I opened the hotel for visitors. We slept in Louis Dupuy's bedroom on a 5-foot-long bed with a horsehair mattress and roped springs. We were just newlyweds, so we managed to survive. We cooked in the kitchen, used the pantry for my sewing machine and ironing board. I really loved the job, all except for turning the lights on and off in the wine cellar. It was really creepy. The first year was pretty slow, but business eventually picked up, and the staff of guides and costumes were hired along with a French pastry chef who baked fresh croissants daily. The hotel closed October 1st for the season, and the Dames decided they did not need a live-in caretaker. So we moved out and rented a small building that was called the Georgetown Grill, which sat right where the roundabout is now. I continued to work at the hotel, however, for another summer. Horses were such an important part of our living. Breeding, raising, and training them was an exciting part of our lives. Our first Andy was born right here in our corral. He was a sweetheart, really, and you can see him just after he was foaled. And of course, we had to celebrate with a little champagne. Andy was foaled in '96. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, of course. I taught him to lead off of his mother, Breezy, and then a light load, eventually in harness to pull a carriage, and finally to ride. So here is the first Andy and the second Andy. First Andy was 1949, and second Andy is with myself and my great-granddaughter Iris in front of me in the saddle. What a thrill to do that. Hunting was such an important part of Buff's dad's and his brother's lives, I decided I had better learn how to shoot if I was ever going to see the hunters during the season. I learned to shoot with a Winchester Model 94 long barrel 30-30 rifle with open sights. I shot my first buck deer the fall of 1954 at Highland Park, which overlooks Easter Seal Handy Camp. For many years, it was me and the boys. My next gun was an 1899 300 Savage, Buff's dad's gun. He bought it and 2 boxes of ammo from K&A in 1941 for $75. The shells were the very last available because of the start of World War II. They had to last until the end of the war. After missing several shots in a few years, I had a scope put on my rifle. My first elk was a spike, not very good, but he was sure good eating. This guy's a little bit bigger. Cooking for 7 was a real challenge on that little sheep herder stove. The hard work starts after you pull the trigger, that's for sure. Not always nice weather when you're hunting, and sometimes it's a very challenging shot. That picture of me in the dead tree is Georgetown way behind me and down about 600 feet. You never know what you're going to see when you're hunting. It's not meat until it's in the freezer. My last elk I killed in 2006 when I was 73. In 1973, a group of ladies organized a riding club known as the Saddlebags. This shot here, we were headed to the Mount of the Holy Cross, which is out of Minturn, Colorado. The first group, the starters, the charter girls, were Ruth Ann Bailey, Shirley Shimon, and Susie Mache. They rode to Breckenridge and back. I joined the group in 1975. I didn't ride every year. By 1986, I was tired of packing everything I needed behind my saddle: food, sleeping bag, vodka, and so forth. Buff and I had acquired a team of horses that we could ride or drive or pack. So I rode Thunder, and we packed Cloud. That was much better. We grew to 7 ladies eventually. We would sometimes be out for 4 days. Our favorite ride was to Shrine Pass, just east of Vail Pass. We trailered to the campground and then took J-rides from there. Our 25th anniversary was in 1997, again at Shrine Pass. None of us ride anymore, the exception being I rode my horse Andy up to hunting camp this past fall, just to reminisce a bit. We still enjoy getting together and reminiscing about the old days and the miracle we all survived without serious injury to horses or to us. After Ben Draper's The Big Do left town, it was pretty quiet. Between having babies, in 1957, Buff and I started a square dance club called the Mountain Mixers. We grew to around 20 members. Buff and I had danced quite a bit on the ranch, so with a brand new record player with variable speed, we were able to teach the dances to adults as well as children. We danced in the basement of the library. We got good enough that we did exhibition dancing down at the Easter Seal Handy Camp and in Georgetown for Georgetown Days, where this photo was taken. The members there that some people might remember are Bill and Henrietta Layton, Perry Hart, Colleen Buckley, Buff and myself, and Bill Marshall. In 1958, the McClellan Players were organized. I don't remember who or how we went about the organization. I do remember Cynthia Willett and Charlie Christensen were charter members. We did 2 plays in summer, in July and August, some of us performing in July while learning a new one for August. Buff was usually the hero, Cora Lou Anderson a heroine, several villains, Steve Epps in the photo, also George Gaubitz, and I was always the villainess. We performed in many places, including McClellan Hall, which was a beautiful theater, upstairs in the Star Hook and Ladder, which is now Town Hall, the Rathskeller in the Silver Queen restaurant, and in a large tent on the library lawn where the new addition is now. We were invited to put on a production of Curse You Jack Dalton at the Crystal Palace in Aspen in 1967. A popular addition to the place itself was Oleo's, which was entertainment between acts while sets were changed. My sister Marcia, a local friend, Pat Livingston, and I sang silly 19th century songs. My favorite Oleo is called The Lion's Cage, and as a tribute to Cynthia Willett, a longtime resident actress and singer who sang the song much better than I, but I will try. Here it is. A mother once she had a lovely daughter. The mother was an actress on the stage, and every night to earn her meager living, she would dance inside the roaring lion's cage. One day the daughter had a premonition that everything that night would not go right, and so she told her mother in the kitchen, "Oh, don't go in the lion's cage tonight. Oh, don't go in the cage tonight, Mama darling, for the lions are ferocious and they bite, roof, roof. And when they get those angry fits, they will tear you all to bits. Oh, don't go in the lion's cage tonight." The mother heeded not the daughter's warning, but turned to her and softly said, "Pooh-pooh, I think I ought to know just what I'm doing. When I'm not there, the lions all feel a blue." That night as she was dancing in the lion's cage, the lions thought that they would like to eat. And as they bit the darling mother's head off, these words came back to her so soft and sweet. "Oh, don't go in the cage tonight, Mama darling, for the lions are ferocious and they bite, roof, roof. And when they get those angry fits, they will tear you all to bits. Oh, don't go in the lion's cage tonight. No, not tonight." All right, Fasching was German Mardi Gras, the week before Lent started. It began in Georgetown in the early 70s. A king and queen were elected and sent to Munich, Germany in the early years, and their royalty came here. Later, we exchanged with St. Paul Winter Carnival King and Queen. Foshing started the week before Lent, and for a week there was a party someplace every night with high priority on costumes. We encouraged Kinderfasching. The kids would parade downtown in their costumes and then go to a party. The king was put in a casket on Sunday and then taken to a bar for one last drink. Poverty Folly started in the 80s. It was held at the community center on April 15th, Tax Day. We elected a king and queen, and their special thrones were toilets. Dinner was mulligan stew. Dick Krekel, who entertained us wonderfully on the piano in 1992, was a big draw to the Poverty Follies. I guess I must have received a refund as my attire improved considerably. Historic Georgetown auctions were always required an appropriate costume according to the theme. Steamboatin' was in 1982 and Tea House of the August Moon in 1985. In 2011, HGI threw a Mardi Gras party trying to revive Foshing. Most of you will remember the John Denver movie filmed here almost entirely in Georgetown in 1986. It was called The Christmas Gift. My good friend Polly Werlin and I were hired to provide horses, a sleigh, and a carriage, and the knowledge to harness and bridle the horses to appear at the proper place in time for filming. It refused to snow that year, 1986, so dump trucks and front-end loaders were hired to get snow from Guanella Pass, enough to cover 6th Street from one end of town to the other. It was even too warm to make snow. They tried it with Loveland snowmaking equipment, and it came out like a Slurpee. A canteen trailer was parked next to the community center, and the cast and crew received all their meals there. John Denver threw a Super Bowl party at the Ram for all the cast and crew. The leading lady actress, Jane Kazmarek, was the postmistress in the movie. She was supposed to do all the horse driving, but once the horse lifted its tail and left out a load, she fell apart, and then John had to do the driving. He was a horseman, but had never driven a horse before. So while we were filming the ranch scenes in Breckenridge, the director said to me, "I'll give you 30 minutes to teach John how to drive the horse." Boy, was that fun or what? The United Way documentary was filmed in 1986 in November. United Way came to Georgetown to film a documentary about the creation of the United Way in the 1800s. The organization raised money for needy causes. The story goes that a priest, a rabbi, and a minister gathered together in Denver and put the organization together. The director felt Georgetown looked like Denver in the 19th century. Polly Werlin and Shirley Shemin rode horses while I drove the horse Kizzy on the buggy, all just for background scenery. Two of the directors had Thanksgiving dinner with my family and I. That was really special too. In April of 1988, I was hired to ski and double for Angela Lansbury in Murder, She Wrote, a TV movie called Snow White, Blood Red. This was a second unit filming. That's movie lingo, of course. So I never met Angela, but I put on her ski pants and parka, skied down Turtle Creek, a run at Loveland Basin, skied down to number 1 lift. The photographer skied right next to me with his camera on my skis. When he said turn, I'd better turn or we would have crashed. No snow plowing was allowed. When I stopped at the bottom and turned around, I became Angela. Movie magic. In March of 1993, Buff and I were hired to do background scenery for a CD called A Romantic Christmas by John Tesh. We picked up a family, the Terry Ruckregals, with a team and on the carriage and drove around that frozen lake up Bard Creek by that fancy circle of houses. Then we're down to the castle next to the cemetery to visit Grandma, played by Polly Whirlin, and then to the Hamill House for a festive Christmas party. It's taken many years to learn what flowers do well in this climate and elevation, but I had good teachers, the local ladies of Georgetown. Several of us had an unsaid competition on growing sweet peas. I have a very special interest in sweet peas as they were my wedding bouquet in 1952, and when my daughter Mary was married in 1989, I had enough sweet peas to put in her bouquet also. Lately, Vivian Buckley has showed us up most years. Presbyterian Church had a weed path and a dirt path to the door of the fellowship hall south of the church building. In the late 60s, Buff and I had a sidewalk and low rock walls on either side put in, which created 2 garden plots. This became a memorial garden for our daughter Judy, who died in July of 1965. I experimented with different annuals and perennials and have been doing so ever since. I've always loved wildflowers, and with patience they will bloom by July. The mountain ash tree in my yard is all on its own. Sometime in the 80s, my friend Polly Whirlin and I realized that the booths at Christmas market didn't have any natural evergreen wreaths and swags for sale. So we took care of that for several years and also took orders from businesses, both in town, the bank building there, and out of town at Loveland, where we made 100 swags and 4 6-foot wreaths one year for them. There was so much interest in natural decorations that Polly and I held classes in my garage. Buff worked at Arapahoe Basin for 5 years and Loveland for 30, so of course I learned to ski and became a powder hound by age 70. When I quit, our kids learned to ski in the Snow Dodgers Club. Our son Bruce went on to race with the Loveland Racing Club. I soon learned that snowshoeing uses another whole set of muscles. A ladies' group often snowshoed at Silverdale. Once, Buff and I ventured up Crystal Creek to Anderson's cabin and also to our hunting camp on snowshoes in the winter. In 1959, we decided it was time to build our own house. We had bought all the lots, 16 of them, less 3, in Block 57 from Buff's dad, who had bought them at a tax sale in the 40s. We paid his father $40 a lot. We chose 2 lots adjacent to the horse corrals so we could keep an eye on the horses. I learned all about building forms, pouring concrete, framing, and being left-handed I came in handy many times. After work at Loveland, we would bundle up the kids, give them scrap wood to play with, and a crib to sleep in and work till midnight. Years later, we decided to give the house a more Victorian look. We lived in that house until 1977. We built the Red Barn in 1966. Next to the barn is an old barn that Buff's father built in the 40s with used materials, and it's still standing. Absolutely amazing. Behind the barn, which there was a 3-story tar paper and creosote-soaked timbered mill. It burned down in 1958, and boy, did it light up the valley from one end to the other. We were asked if it would improve the view of our property, and we said yes, of course, but we also said no, we did not set it on fire. Buffs, let's see. In 1974, we started on house number 2, right next door. We wanted a fireplace and a workshop. Again, we did all the building ourselves except for the fireplace. We moved in 1977. Incidentally, the first house cost us $10,000 and the second one $35,000, plus our labor, of course. Next project was the carriage house, which we built in 1986. We had too many carriages that were out in the weather and we needed to get them under cover. To build the picnic pavilion, we had to move Max Gordon's house. In 1980, we did that and donated it to Historic Georgetown, Inc., and it now sits behind the Bowman White House. 7 years later, we built the pavilion, preparing to start for Rutherford carriage service and picnic pavilion business. We used the pavilion for our guests after a hayride, where Buff would recite cowboy poetry as we gathered around the fire with hot cider or hot chocolate. We started our small business with our wedding carriage in 1970. It was very crude but fun. It was a chariot, and the bride and groom were Jeannie Wellman and Dwayne Messner, and they insisted on it, and we loved doing it. Buff left Loveland in 1988. That's when we opened our business for real. We added a wire-wheeled surrey and eventually a vis-a-vis, which means face-to-face, a hay wagon, and then we built a trolley and gave historic tours through town. We always found time to hitch up for special occasions like an Easter egg hunt. Some very emotional rides were Mary Josh's funeral in Silver Plume in 1995, and of course, my sweetheart's last ride in August of 2010. You may have noticed different colored horses in the photos. We started with Belgians who were normally red or gold, and then in 1995 we acquired Percherons, Dolly and Daisy, which were Buff's very favorite horses. Employment possibilities were few and far between for women in 1940s and 50s. I did some alterations for Hazel McAdams at the Hotel de Paris, Mellie White at the Bowman White House. I wrote letters for several ladies with failing eyesight. My first job, as I already mentioned, was the Hotel de Paris as their first curator. I had 2 babies, Bruce and Judy, in the mid-50s and Mary in 1968 that kept me at home. Eventually, I found employment as hostess at the Alpine Inn restaurant, waitress at Curly's Coffee House in 1959, salesperson at Mountain Gaelic Irish Shop next to K&A, many years at Shop International, and recently at the Visitor Information Center on 6th Street. There's lots of things I've done in the past that I can no longer do or choose not to do. But when in doubt, there's always volunteering. To name a few, in my 62 years, I was teacher's aide at the grade school, the first Citizen of the Year in 1983, and do let me explain that. That was given to somebody who did something that was good for the town. In the summer of that year, I was renting our house next door, and the lady gave a beer party for our teenage daughter and her friends. When I heard about that, I was slightly upset, so I asked the lady to leave, and Buff and I turned our rental house into a youth center, and we let it be used by the teenagers for several years, supported by churches and businesses in town. It was a good feeling. Also, I was on the first Clear Creek Metropolitan Recreation Board, president of the Chamber of Commerce for a couple years, Design Review Commission, chaplain for PEO Sisterhood, elder at First Presbyterian Church, volunteered at the Hotel de Paris and also Historic Georgetown, Inc. at the Hamel House, Georgetown Heritage Center, the community choir. If any of you are bored or feel useless, just to look around, there's always something to volunteer for. In my 62 years, I've seen the population triple, maybe quadruple. Many streets have been paved. I-70 went in the 70s or 60s. Water and sewer rates went up from $7.50 a month to over $100. Electronics take over the art of face-to-face visiting, handwritten letters. But on the plus side, Georgetown has always been accepting and accommodating to single parents, handicapped children and adults, varying lifestyles, widows, widowers, and the growing population of seniors. The recreation of the Rutherford Trail makes me proud to bear the name of my family. It was created 2 years ago after Buff's father, who used this as a wagon road up to the mines to bring supplies to the different mines. It was then wide enough to pull a wagon and a team of 4 horses. A lot of it disappeared in the flood of 1965 when torrential rains came down from South Clear Creek. Some people call it Leavenworth Creek, but that is joining South Clear Creek, and the town flooded terribly that year. So the once wide wagon road became a washed out narrow path. Grandpa Rutherford would also go up to the lake and cut ice off of the reservoir and bring it down and store it in the house, in the building that was the freight depot for the train. And it would be stored in sawdust, and it would last most of the summer for the people who still used ice blocks for their ice cubes. Well, thank you for coming to listen to what I consider a lifetime full of adventure and loving family and friends. When I've been asked, have you lived here all your life? My answer is, not yet.